Welcome back to night 3 of the Community Conversations series. So glad to see you all here tonight. I am Kelly Scott. This is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Jennifer Clark. I have the distinct privilege of being the executive director at Clarehouse, where, as most of you probably know, we provide a loving home and quality care for terminally ill people who need more help than they can get at home. We've been doing this for 20 years.
Whoop, whoop.
We're celebrating a big anniversary this year, and we've been honored to care for 6,000 people in the 20 years that we've been doing this. Yeah, thank you. We know that that impact extends well beyond those people in the beds and affects those who have loved them and have said goodbye to them and have gone out to pick up their lives. And so we are really happy to gather up all of this wisdom that we have collected and collated over the years and be able to share that, as well as hear your thoughts about what dying teaches us about living. And those lessons are why we've gathered this year for this series. So Dr. Clark is going to bring us all up to speed over what we learned the previous 2 weeks, just in case you weren't here or you've slept since then.
So our first night was really about the changing dialogue around death and dying in America, particularly. I was reminded by a friend about the early days with some of you remember Ernest Becker's book around denial of death. And of course, many of you touched by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Dame Cicely Saunders and their early writings in the hospice movement, and really pulling death and dying out of the closet that had been shoved in. And the work that Clarehouse has done and many of the Omega homes around the country over the last 20 years has really pulled it back out of the closet, bringing it back into community as a primary experience in our human lives. And so with that dawning, we are able to shift the conversation now, how, kind of now that we're no longer denying death, we can actually start looking at its meaning, particularly for those of us who are living, and the powerful lessons that those who are dying, those that are surrounded by them, experience and can teach us about everyday life. So the first night, as you can see, kind of summaries. You'll have to forgive me I don't want to crack my neck. There's a very distinct possibility of doing that by craning it this way. So I'm going to look at my phone. So our first lesson was really about this thing of death and dying actually belong where there's life and living, and really bringing death back into the community versus regulating it to a dark hallway in a hospital opens us up to the possibilities. Over the last decade, there's been a profound amount of neuroscience and understanding, particularly the traumatic brain. And through that study, we have come to understand the neuroscience of dying and the experiences that those that we love go through. And so understanding what suffering really means in context, and that there is a little bit of a choice in that, and how that experience comes into our lives, particularly as we face our own mortality. We talked about the fact that in addition to understanding trauma and suffering and reframing it in the concept of that cake-like brain. Some of you who weren't here in that first couple of nights, we've got some images in your folders to kind of look at and digest. But we now know that what religion and philosophy has talked about for millennia, our soul, our spirit, is now being brought into the scientific world. And we're really spending a lot of time and energy looking at this concept of consciousness, this thing that makes us alive. And for those of you who have been at the bedside of someone at the moment of death, knows in its absence that there was something profound when it's gone. And so really talking about consciousness and how it plays into the dying experience, and understanding that dying is a universal experience, and that ultimately death is the most creative endeavor of our human lives. The second night really started focusing on the direct experiences of death and dying. We shared the brutal excerpt from Terms of Endearment that illustrates both sides of the pain experience. You know, kind of, we didn't get to see Deborah Winger's character suffering from ovarian cancer and the profound pain that can accompany that disease. We got to bear witness to her mother screaming for the relief of her pain. Both of those embodiments, you know, kind of are the thing we're most afraid of, that we'll die in pain and that because of that we'll die alone. And so we really talked about, you know, kind of what pain is, not only experienced by the one in that bed, but those that are surrounding them, and really the call of compassion. And then we moved into, you know, the intensity of those weeks, days, hours, and minutes around the bedside of a dying person, and what they're experiencing and what can it teach us about day-to-day life, and really turning inward and really experiencing our inner lives, particularly as we're, you know, kind of turning away from our societal roles, turning our sensory experience inward, the profundity of learning about who we are, getting down into that essence of things, you know, was an exercise we took everyone through. You know, just really taking the time to sensory withdraw and socially withdraw on a routine basis enriches our lives, and the dying are those that are teaching us that. When we're able to turn inward and get away from our friends here and any other screen that might be in our pockets or pocketbooks, there is room for amazing things to happen. Awe, wonder, joy, curiosity, inspiration, aspiration, all those positive emotions that we're constantly clamoring for and trying to bring about with all the consumption that we have because of all the things that we have access to. But it's in making room and getting in the quiet that those things are able to be unleashed. And then, you know, kind of finally leaving with you this idea of embracing the terrible sublime. For those of you in the art world, you totally know what I'm talking about. For those of us who are not part of the art world, it is the breathtaking experience of seeing a piece of art like the Pieta, where you can't help but just look at it in wonder. But there's a part of it that's horribly painful, right? There's this profound suffering in this mother holding her child in his death. But the beauty of that, the emotion of that, the expression of the entire experience of human, you know, kind of humanness from beginning to end, draws us in. And that is the terrible sublime. And when you're at the bedside of a loved one, particularly in last hours, it can be that. And being able to embrace that and live in the paradox, as I've shared, I think is one of the hallmarks of a fully developed human. And so that kind of closes us and catches us up to speed. But we wanted to live a little, you know, kind of our liminal space, right? So this is the gap between the two trapeze we talked about on that first night. Are there any comments or questions before we move into our last night? Yes. Sure.
But there was a man that when you were talking about what happened that you wish never happened, but because of it, I couldn't remember Stephen.
It's Stephen Colbert.
And that full interview is
Yeah.
available on YouTube?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you
If
can
you wanna
type
watch
in.
that.
It's been watched millions of times. It's touched people. I mean, I get asked about that frequently, and so yeah, beautiful interview. What's that? I think it's All God's Punishments. If you type that in, it'll come up. If you type in Stephen Colbert, Anderson Cooper, it'll come up. It was on CNN, I think. So, other questions? Any comments you want to add?
Nope.
Great. You guys ready for night 3? Brum, brum, brum.
So we're going to move into that emotional and spiritual space. And of course, where that starts, I think, for most people is grief. I love this meme. I think it's a perfect example of what people expect versus what they actually experience. I Googled grief because I wanted to see, if you just type that into the search bar, what is the most common question that people ask. And I laughed out loud when I read it because it said, what are the 5 stages of grief in order? The most common question that people ask when they think about grief. And so let's just get them out there. You know them, say them with me. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those are the 5 standard stages. And sometimes we all, in our sort of linear chronological minds, think that we start with one and we move to the next and that's done. And we tick that off and we move to the next and we move to the next. And grief is just not like that. It is so chaotic. It is, you feel like you're going back to the beginning over and over and over. And I think that we do a huge disservice to that process by expecting it to be a certain way. So I also made a list of just things that I know have learned personally through my own grieving and through the work that I've done about grief. And the number one thing that I would say to you and encourage you to fully embrace is that everybody gets to do it their own way. There is no one way, there's no right way, there's no my way. It's an individual process, and everybody gets to do that their own way. This is incredibly challenging when you're in the middle of a family dynamic where people are grieving in ways that are completely opposite of yours. And it's really hard to let people be who they are and experience the way that they need to. But from a mental health standpoint, I think it's just a huge gift to everyone if you can say, this is how I need to do it. You're free to do it however you want to. And that covers all aspects of grief, whether that's the way people navigate a life-threatening illness and how they communicate with physicians or with each other, or all the way to the moment of death, whether somebody wants to view the body and somebody doesn't. Or how people cope afterwards and when they're supposed to be over it or start feeling better. All of those things are so very individualized. So nobody gets to tell anybody how to do grief best. Grief is anticipatory. It is something that you start to experience at the first threat of a loss or the first experience of a loss. And that doesn't mean death. That means the diagnosis of a serious illness where suddenly your hope of the future that you expected has been threatened or even taken away. It is the experience of serious illness where you might be losing body parts, you might be losing your appearance, your independence, your dignity, your self-control. All of those things are losses. It may be a job, a role, a relationship. All of those things are a part of that anticipatory grieving that happens well before the death actually even occurs. And so honoring that as we're going through this very challenging event, whether we're the one experiencing the illness or our loved one is, we're already grieving well before a death ever happens. It's not just the death that makes that start. Grief is really sensory. Sounds, smells, aromas, a deja vu feeling, things that happen in the external environment that throw you right back into that space of grief. It can be really affected by sights, sounds, smells, touches, all of those things that put you back in that space where you connect with something that happened and it hits you like a freight train. And suddenly your heart is breaking all over again and you can't breathe because it hurts so bad. Those things happen and they come at the oddest whim. It's just amazing what can trigger that response and get you started down a path where you thought I was already done with that. I thought I was through that. I thought I was over that. But you're still in that tangled ball of yarn. Re-entry into the world is often immediately required. You get, 3 days? And then you have to get back into your world after a death. And that re-entry is foreign to most people because you're coming back into everyday life where people are going on as if nothing's happened and you've just lost the most important person in your life or experienced a very traumatic experience or a very profound, meaningful experience. And yet everybody's just going to work and driving in their car and cooking supper and doesn't make any sense. How do you get back into your everyday life, your everyday world, because you're re-entering that with this new burden of grief that you're still trying to even figure out what it feels like. One of the most profound examples that I ever saw and stays with me to this day was a young family that we took care of at Clarehouse in the very, very early days. And this amazing young woman had a baby who was terminally ill, and she knew when she was giving birth that he was not going to survive more than a few weeks. And she made a very courageous decision to let nature take its course, and she brought him to Clarehouse. Her partner and she lived with us during those 10 days that he was with us, 8 days that he was with us. He came to us at 2 days old and died on his 10th day. And it was just an amazing, horrible, wonderful, beautiful, suffering experience for everyone involved. And we loved that kid more than I think some children have their entire growing up years. And it was such an honor to be a part of that and to help this young couple through this major, major loss. But what I wanted to share with you was when it came time to leave, after he died, it was about 2:00 in the morning, and they said, "Can we spend the night? Can we stay in the room one more night? We're not ready to go back home." And I said, "Of course." And they went to bed, and they got up the next morning, and we made coffee and we fixed him breakfast and had some more conversation, and they packed up their stuff and they got ready to leave. And they literally went to the door, and the father tried to step over the threshold to go outside the door of the apartment, and he couldn't. And he was doing like this, and he turned around and he said, I can't do it. I can't go back out there. That world doesn't know him. This is the only space that knew him. And so we came back in and sat down again and talked some more. And then they had to try again. And it was a physical wrenching for both of them to leave that space and go back out into what they felt like was just a really hard, cold world for them to re-enter. So honor that re-entry that has to happen with grief. I think denial gets a really bad rap. People think that that's a dysfunctional response to grief, and it's really not. It's a wonderful coping tool. Our mind uses that to protect us until we're ready to process the information that we have to do. And we don't need to drag anybody kicking and screaming out of their denial. We don't need to call that out and say, they're in denial, call the social worker. Get somebody in here to talk to them. Make them see this, make them face this. It's not necessary. It may become dysfunctional, it may become pathological, but for most people, most of the time, it's serving some useful purpose, and they'll get to it in their time when they're able to face it and cope with that. So denial is not our enemy, and it's one of those tools and one of those coping mechanisms that we can embrace. Grief is also cumulative. So for those of you particularly that work with people who are dying and grieving on a regular basis, and for people that have just experienced multiple losses, especially in short succession, it's cumulative. And we may not grieve fully every single loss as it happens, but our soul stores that up. And it's going to be there eventually to deal with. It's just because we we keep going, maybe especially if you're a hospice worker, if you work in a hospital. I know there's a lot of nursing students here. We can't grieve every single relationship and death that comes to us. There is that professional boundary. There is that separation that we have to use to survive when we work with dying people. But rest assured, it's all there. It's stored up in your soul, and something's going to set it off. And it might be a song on the radio, and it might be the commercial you see at Christmas time where the soldier comes home and surprises his mama because she smells the coffee brewing in the kitchen, and comes downstairs and they reunite. And you'll burst into tears, and your family will look at you like you've lost your mind. There are triggers that are going to bring that grief to the surface. And sometimes what you're grieving today is not the most recent loss you had, but maybe it's a loss you had 5 years ago or 20 years ago. There is no continuum of time that makes sense with grief, and it comes back and will hit you when you least expect it. But honor that accumulated sense of grief that you might feel, and when it overwhelms you, take a pause. Feel it, think about it, experience it, and do what you need to do to work through that emotion, and know that it's coming back up because there's still some healing that needs to happen there.
Can I say something?
Yes.
So grief is an emotion, just like joy, just like happiness, sadness, anger. So the fact that, I'm done grieving. Well, are you done being happy? I mean, okay. So, so it's kind of interesting, right? Oh, I'm over my grief. You don't get over grief. It's an emotion that has to be felt before we actually can go into the process of grieving. And like many emotions, grief affects us both psychologically and physiologically. How many of you have heard of the grief sweats? Yeah, our tears, our body odor, everything changes. If I were to stick you in an MRI, and I've been talking about MRIs, but it is what it is. If I stick you in an MRI, your social networks, your ability to read faces and unspoken language and communication, you can't do it. That's why reentry is so freaking hard. And language is really, really important. We have mourning, which is the period of time where you actually get to feel grief. And then we have bereavement, which is where you take that grief and that loss and actually go through the process of grieving. And so if you're not feeling the grief, you can't grieve. So it's not until you actually go through that torrent of emotions can the loss actually be incorporated into your life. So give space to it. Give it time and air. Because when it gets shoved down, and yes, denial can help us get through the moment and get through certain times. But at some point, you need to say, okay, it's time. I'm ready to unleash the beast. Because again, what you don't deal with in life, you would deal with in death. And that's one of the things that they've taught us, is that grief will come out at some point before your time is gone. And so give it space. Give your loved ones the space to feel grief and go through the ugly crying stages and the stinky stages and all the things that come with it, right? Or the stages where you're holding absolute profound sorrow accompanied with profound and utter joy. It's all there. Grief is that amalgamation of every human emotion all knotted up in one. And it needs space and time, because it's just the flip side of love. You can't have grief without it.
And it builds on each other. Each loss builds on the next or the previous one. And good or bad, if it's a healthy, functional grief experience, you're going to be a little better equipped the next with the next one and the next one. And again, this might be a death, it might be a divorce, it might be a loss of a job, it might be a relocation where you have to build a whole new community around yourself again. But you learn from each one, you build positive or negative coping skills to help you through that, and you carry that to the next experience. People that have a really bad death experience where their loved one suffered and they had all kinds of regrets and nothing went the way they wanted, you carry that memory. It becomes a part of your story. It's part of your family story. It's something you tell over and over, and good or bad, that becomes imprinted on your soul and is a part of who you are, and you carry that to the next experience. So if everyone around you was unkind and uncaring, you're going to kind of expect that the next time. So now you're setting yourself up for maybe seeing that happen a second time or a third time. And so it can build and build and build positively or negatively throughout your life as you continually experience the challenges that are all about living, which includes loss.
So, on that note, it's important that you have a community to process loss, because you can't do it by yourself. That's why pain calls compassion, right? We've had these wonderful stories that Clarehouse has brought to this community. Tulsa's privileged to have a space where grief is allowed in all of its glory. We've talked about how we care for the dying and how many of our family members have come to Clarehouse to be part of this community, to continue, the work of paying it forward and understanding, again, that death and dying belong where there's life and living. But when those of us who are the caregivers actually suffer our own losses, it's a privilege to have a community to go to. As someone who has suffered a traumatic loss, my father died by suicide the Monday after Thanksgiving in 2021. I was fortunate enough to be bathed in a community where I didn't have to explain a damn thing. I didn't have to worry about the trauma and the words and the things that come with suffering a traumatic death. I was welcomed, embraced, allowed to go through denial, anger, grief. It's still, by the way, happening, obviously, and finally into a place of acceptance. And that wouldn't have been I would not have had the privilege of that had this community not been there. And I know I'm not the only one to feel that and come out the other side, because there is this poetic resilience that comes from being able to bear your grief, particularly in community, being held with compassionate hands, so that someday that you might actually be able to grieve and incorporate that loss. This poem by John McClain really hits home on this, and so wanted to read it to you, because this is the beauty side of grief. This is that terrible sublime, right? This is what Stephen Colbert was talking about. I would never wish the worst thing that ever happened to me on anyone, but there's this weird guilt that I'm so glad that it did, because it allowed me to love more. It allowed me to be compassionate. It allowed me to be a better mom, wife, healer, friend. And I don't know if I want to give that part back. So, grief's poetic resilience. In shadows deep, grief finds its dwelling place. A heavy cloak, its touch leaves no trace. With shattered heart, we tread the path of woe. In sorrow's grip, emotions ebb and flow. The ache within, a tempest fierce and wild, reminding us of love once brightly styled. Like barren trees, our souls stand stark and bare, haunted by memories we no longer to share. Loss's cruel sting, a wound that won't relent, a silent ache no words can circumvent. Yet in this darkness, seeds of strength reside, a resilience, a flicker deep inside. Through tears and sighs, we seek the dawn anew, embracing love, though pain may still ensue. For in the depths of grief, we learn to heal, to find solace in the love that we still feel. Grief can get a little complicated, particularly when we have cultural norms, societal norms, politics, religion, philosophy, family belief systems that come to visit, particularly during the time of death and dying, that can really teach us about how to approach things when living. We've softly put this in icons, archetypes, and ideologies, whatever that happens to be, because there seems to be a whole lot of divisiveness around those things nowadays, are wildly powerful tools that need to be minded with wisdom. We have seen how these belief systems, whatever they happen to be, have a pretty stark experience where, you know, the line of faith or a tradition gets picked up and is used as a thread by which to make the tapestry of a family life. And we've also seen it picked up in the form of a sword and wield in violence towards oneself and others. Should icons, archetypes, and ideologies be within your life and within your family's life, we ask you that you be mindful and wise with it, because they are such powerful, powerful tools, can help us with our grief, can help us with our suffering, but also has the power to inflict it with significant intensity. We have seen the beauty of spirituality practiced within the framework of religion. And for those of you who that's a new kind of concept, spirituality and religion are not synonymous. They're two different experiences. Spirituality can be practiced through a religion, can be practiced through politics, can be practiced through a philosophy. So spirituality is a wholly different experience than the practice of a religion and the faith-based practices. And so understanding how that plays in, what it means to you and your family is really, really important, not only at the time of death, but also during you and your family's life. You want to add anything?
A story that I wanted to share came to mind thinking about that sword that can hurt someone. And this was a family, their loved one had an injury where it's called an anoxic brain injury. So they didn't get oxygen to the brain and were in a coma or a persistent vegetative state, unresponsive, however you want to describe that. And these were very faithful people in their church community, and their church members were visiting at the hospital very, very frequently. And everyone was certain that healing would come with prayer and that they would stand firm in their faith and that would happen. And it didn't happen. And eventually this couple chose to leave the hospital, take their loved one off of life support, and let nature take its course at Clarehouse. And yet, to make that decision, they felt so in conflict with their community, their entire support community of people, that they didn't tell them that. They didn't tell the truth. They didn't tell anyone where they were going. They came to us and spent those last 10 days or so with their loved one in isolation from their community with the support of us, but not their family, their support, because they had failed in their belief that that healing would come through prayer. And the conflict, the emotional suffering that came about, the spiritual suffering that came about because of that choice, they felt like they did absolutely the right thing for their person. But it didn't, they hit this brick wall that was not in alignment with the reality of what the experience was. And it was really hard to watch and to know that at that most crucial time they had to distance themselves from their community.
The other pieces, two other kind of phenomenon that we see is comparative suffering. Yeah, I heard it. So it is exactly what it means is, my suffering's worse than yours, sister, right? So therefore, right? So this comparative suffering piece of things adds a whole nother layer of complexity. So be mindful of that, watch for that. It's really interesting, I could quote Brene Brown a bajillion times a day. But one of the things that's really interesting in comparative suffering, particularly in large Irish Catholic families like mine, is the concept of a shared common enemy. So, yeah, you see, I got people laughing already going, I know exactly what that is, right? You're one of 7 kids and the 2 sisters gang up on the other sister and they start talking smack about each other. And it's, you know what I'm saying, right? It's all it is I don't want to be alone in this, right? So it's all, and typically comes from a place of just wanting to belong
and misplaced anger.
Where there's that, right? But comparative suffering happens quite a bit, and it's typically involving something around this. The other one, and the one that's been hard as a physician caring for someone, is redemptive suffering. Is causing one's own pain as a way to redeem oneself of decisions made in this lifetime. So wielding that sword towards oneself. There's a lot of interesting ethical conversations around that, a lot of different ways of helping people grieve in their own way, but at what point do I step in because harm is being caused? And so we often see it as a consequence of a religious past or an active religious practice that involves some sort of redemptive suffering to relieve or allay any sort of guilt or shame. And it's hard to kind of watch and participate in as much as possible. And so kind of keeping barriers around that, but recognizing everybody's got to process their grief and suffering in their own way. So redemptive suffering. Blaming oneself. So I'll just tell a story of a patient of mine. She had multiple sclerosis. She grew up in a big, very big Catholic Italian family and had underwent an abortion at a young age. Controversial, I know, but this is her story. And felt like her MS was her redemption. And having to walk that existential suffering with her based on, the belief system of her and her family. So that's what I'm saying, that these are really powerful, powerful tools that shape us. And it's something we need to be conscious of. because sometimes that gets wielded at somebody and it's not their own. And so we just need to be mindful of these very, very powerful tools that we have that shape us, our culture, our society. You don't want to fall. This is one of my favorite things to say to my students. Don't suffer from the horrible case of the shoulds, right? Don't should yourself or others, please, right? That's where a little bit of this comes in. So culture, societal norms, faith traditions, philosophies, family belief systems all get to be on display during the time of death, dying, and the subsequent grief. And so we try to bring this out and try to normalize things and talk through things in an open, honest, and compassionate way. But sometimes it can be really, really tough.
And it's worth saying again that dying is a very spiritual experience, but not necessarily religious. And whether you come from a deep, rich, traditional religious background or whether you have no understanding or knowledge whatsoever of a higher power or what comes next, regardless where you fall in those extremes, dying is still, that's part of how you're going to experience dying is through your spirit, through your soul. And we all have that. We all claim that. We all run through those traps at the time of death and in that time leading up to it. So there is so much opportunity in that to be open to that spiritual experience because, as we've talked before, people who are dying slowly, like at Clarehouse, like from a prolonged terminal illness or a progressive chronic illness, they begin to exist with one foot in the spiritual world while they're keeping that foot in the physical world, and they're bridging those realms. And the veil between those two worlds becomes increasingly thin as people get closer to death. And we listened to a clip that first night from the author of the book Final Gifts, which is a resource for end-of-life care. For if you've never read it, you should. It's an amazing resource for end-of-life care that talks about the communications that dying people have about what they're experiencing in that spiritual realm. Because as a culture, we're not really given the words to talk about it. We're not given the language to express what we're experiencing during that spiritual transitional time between life and death. And so people use symbolic language. And one of the most common symbolic languages is talking about travel. And so you hear a lot of symbolic talk about packing a suitcase, getting my passport, calling a cab, catching a train, getting on a plane, all of those things that talk about travel. People begin to see people that we can't see, so they're experiencing those spirits that are coming to visit them from another realm. All of those things are those real experiences that people are having as part of that transitory time when they're between two worlds.
Will you talk about the door? I love that story.
This was my own family. A great uncle who was dying in Colorado on the farm that he farmed and lived at for 60 years, and his, I think, 11 children were gathering from all over the country. And one of his sons was sitting at the bedside in his final days with his laptop, just transcribing everything that Uncle Robert was saying because he was talking nonstop. And one of the themes that frequently came up was that he was lying in bed and he was reaching up to the ceiling and he kept saying, "Raymond, open the door. Open the door. Raymond, I can't reach it. Open the door." Raymond was the only Raymond that we knew in the family was an uncle of mine who had died several years prior to that. And we all kind of thought, of this symbolic language, but that was really, really confirmed to us when one of the families that had been traveling had not been there, had not been privy to any of this conversation, and one of the sons arrived with his wife and I think 3 or 4-year-old daughter. And she walked into the room where Uncle Robert was lying there on his deathbed, family gathered around, and she said, "Hi, Papa." And then she looked at her dad and she said, "Dad, what is that door doing up there?" And she saw it because children haven't quite let go of that inner sense.
We work
of
it
that
out of them by the
spiritual
time
world.
they're 8.
Yeah. Yeah, we condition that out of kids, but she was young enough that she still had that. And she saw that same thing that he was seeing, which was just incredible. It was comforting. It was profound. It was just a really cool experience. So I want to talk just a little bit about some of the work that can be done and the work that we try to help people make room for in their dying days. And the very first thing that I think we've talked about this before is how we welcome somebody in and how we get them comfortable, and we try to relieve these burdens and meet those physical needs that are at the bottom of that pyramid so that somebody's comfortable and safe and rested. And then they can start to think about what matters most and free up the emotional, spiritual, psychological energy to tackle some of those things in whatever time that they have left. And the opportunities are profound. And one of the most profound, I think, is the opportunity to reconcile relationships, to reach out to someone that you're estranged from, to say, I'm sorry, I forgive you, will you forgive me, I love you, whatever it is that need to be said. To witness a prisoner being brought into our home in shackles, escorted by a deputy that has picked him up from prison and brought him to Clarehouse to say goodbye to his mother, and they have an hour together in a bedroom before he's taken back to prison and she leaves this earth, is an amazing healing that can happen. It is an opportunity to give that gift of reconciliation to that survivor, that person that is going forward with their lives and will either lose the chance to ever make that right or take comfort in knowing that they reconciled before their loved one died. And it's a profound opportunity that anyone should really consider, is there something in me, in my life, or my loved one's life that work needs to be done. There's the opportunity to finish up business. Very simple things like bookkeeping, financials, handing off the bills to someone. One of the sweetest things I ever saw was an 80-year-old man who he was getting closer and closer to death, but he was getting increasingly restless. And I went in to see him one day and I said, "What's going on? You seem really anxious. Is there something we could help you with?" And he said, "I have always pumped the gas, always. My wife has no idea how to put gas in her car. I don't know what she's going to do. She's going to run out of gas and she's not going to know what to do." And we had a volunteer that took his wife to the gas station on the corner and taught her how to do that. She came back. She told him, "I know how to do it. I can handle it. I'm okay." And that relieved his anxiety. That was what he was holding on to and worrying about. It may be really big things like wills and estates and all of that difficult business that's really hard to conduct when you get to the end. So that's a whole nother program we have, but don't leave that business to the very end. Bucket list. What do you have left that you want to do? Is even if it's just getting one more cheeseburger from Ron's or whatever that might be. A beautiful story of a 30-year-old guy that we took care of that was dying from a brain tumor, and he was an absolute fiend for Star Wars movies.
So cool. This
He
is the
loved,
coolest thing.
he loved Star Wars, and he shared that with his brother, and they had seen every movie, and they were both really grieving the fact that he was not going to survive till the next edition came out. I don't even know which Star Wars movie it was. And his brother wrote to the studio and asked for them to send an advance copy. And I will never forget this studio executive coming into the house with a briefcase that was like handcuffed to his arm. And he had the DVD of the new Star Wars movie. And they went in the bedroom, they put a sign on the door that said no one could enter. And the three of them sat in there and watched that movie. And that family has told that story over and over and over because it's meant so much to them. So what's on your bucket list? We've seen weddings at Clarehouse. We've seen baptisms. We've seen people do significant life events because that's the last thing that they want to do. And then creating a legacy. What do you want to leave behind? Do you have time to think about what you would like to leave for those that you love? And what what imprint you can make on the world. It may be something as simple as writing letters to grandchildren you will never see graduate from college or get married, but they will have this for their parent to give to them on their special day. What is it that you would like to do, and what piece of your heart would you like to leave behind? Our videographer back here has made some amazing gifts for families in the form of videotaping a person, telling them what they want them to know about their life and how much they love them and what they've meant to them. And they never got to see that video until after that person died, because he gave it to us for safekeeping and said, give this to my people when I'm gone. What a gift that they had that to hang on to. You can't do any of that if you're in turmoil, if you're in physical distress, if you're emotionally exhausted. And that's all the more reason to get these things worked out and create that space to do what you need to do so there's no regrets.
Yeah, that Star Wars thing was crazy. Yeah. Crazy. Well, that he was just amazing anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't even know how to. If there is one thing that you take away, is what matters gives meaning. Where are you spending your time? Where's your attention? I am sure doom scrolling on your phone is not giving you any sort of meaning. So your attention and your time is your most precious commodity in this life. We don't get around that. So where are you spending it? And so that question needs to be asked now, because it, as my family says with our Irish and Scottish heritage, sometimes you have to pay the piper, right? And so which side are you going to come out on, right? That doesn't happen while you're in extremis in the bed. It happens now. So,
thoughts, questions, comments?
Before we get
we're going to watch this?
Do you want to watch it now, or do you want to ask that? We got to watch this first.
Okay.
So this should help foster some of your thoughts too. This is a PBS special that was done a couple years ago, I think. Atul Gawande is a surgeon up at Mass General, Harvard Medical School, is also a prolific author. He wrote a book called Being Mortal, which is an anthology of all of his writings about caring for people with serious illness that he wrote for the New Yorker. And so this is a bit of an excerpt from this. Would recommend watching the entire thing. It's amazingly done. Along with all the other things that we gave you in your notebook. But wanted to share this clip with you guys. It's powerful stuff. So to answer your question, it was done by PBS. And the physician's name is Atul, A-T-U-L, Gawande, G-A-W-A-N-D-E.
It's on the reading list in the folders.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you.
Comments? Thoughts? Yeah. Asking about death doulas. It's a very interesting question, because I feel like the entire movement that has been really growing in popularity is something that we've been doing forever at Clarehouse. And I think that it's what our volunteers do. It's what our staff do. Now it's become like this whole formalized program and a way for people to actually make a living doing what our volunteers do every day. And so I don't have anything negative to say about it. I'm not sure that it's something very different than what we do. The doulas, though, what they can do is go into people's homes and support that process on a contracted one-on-one basis. So like you have a physician, you might have a doula. So the doula comes to your house and they help you with the pre-planning. They help you walk through everything that you need as far as all the support that you have in the home. They can be with you and help guide you through the process, but they don't do hands-on care. So that's kind of the distinction, is they're not there to do hands-on care. They have a lot of involvement in death care, in after-death care, and in funeral planning as well. Yeah.
Still pinging off of your comments about the redemptive suffering. And that particular person's belief conflicts with what? This isn't about
Right.
suffering. It's about when people, when can you call in someone in their own faith tradition
Yes.
to kind of maybe correct a concept? They may be holding the notion, what we might think is an error, if there is some comfort to be had.
Right.
Light to be shown on that from someone in their own tradition. And is that something you do, or are you just arguing with the belief and it's going to cause more angst in the end? But to come from a person, a priest in her case.
Oh, yeah, no, for sure. So that's a beautiful thing about practicing palliative care, particularly in hospice care. I never go into a room by myself. No, I mean, I don't hold myself as any sort of truth. I'm willing to hold space to have a conversation with someone. And when that conversation needs to be held with a different voice that may have a different opinion and a different light, then we bring them all in. Yeah, I've called in imams and rabbis, and I don't know how many times I've been present for last rites. You know, so it is wildly important that you, when you get into those existential crises, whether they're spiritual related or religiously related or philosophically related, that you do have the right voice in the room to help, particularly if there is profound unnecessary suffering that is occurring. For sure. That's a great question.
And along with that, I think, is the idea of people thinking that they deserve to suffer. And so I'm not going to access pain medicine because I deserve this, and I'm going to suffer through it and not use that. And maybe their religious doctrine is feeding into that, or maybe there's guilt of something that might be resolved with confession. So all the more reason to get a pastoral resource in there to help.
Yeah.
Have you seen people that don't have a belief in an afterlife or anything coming next have a harder time? They have a harder time
So it's
in their lives?
so we actually studied this.
The question was, do people that don't have a belief in another life struggle more at death?
No. No, actually, that's where the universality of death is actually really cool. So you see kind of this transcendent experience across things. It's a spiritual experience, whether they believe in an afterlife or not. That's not the case. The place where it's actually really the kind of crux to the matter is electing more aggressive medical interventions. And people who actually hold a stronger religious practice elect more medical interventions. So I'll let you come to terms with that on your own, but we've studied that several times to confirm that finding. So that's the place where that occurs. But when we get to the point of death and dying, there is this transcendence beyond the icons, archetypes, and ideologies that occur.
I would think that the dying process would be incredibly personal and individual
Mm.
to the person who's dying. But I have seen on more than one occasion families impose their religious belief on the person who's dying to the point of that person being really uncomfortable with it. It's a terrible conflict. Also, I've seen families push a dying person to fight to live because they don't want to lose them.
So I'll talk about it in general, and then you can talk about your experiences at Clarehouse. Does that sound fair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Ernest Becker wrote a book, 50 years ago. As of this year, just came out with its 50th anniversary, about a book called The Denial of Death. And the hidden, the unconscious hardwiring reptilian brain that we shared harbors that fear of death, compounded by the death of the self, particularly that we talked about. And we will try to make ourselves immortal with symbolic gesture, language, art, religion, philosophy, so that we become immortal. So it's this kind of paradox, but by that, then we're reinforcing this fear of death. And so what happens when families don't talk about death, embrace death, and know what the rituals and rites around it, and understand it as a process of life, what happens then is that fear of death and that fear of their own mortality comes into hard force. And so whatever structure or symbolism has been put around that and contained it tends to come out as a weapon, right? And that's what we were talking about. And so so there's lots of ways to walk families through that. Oftentimes, if it involves a religious tradition, we'll actually bring in the specialist. We'll bring in the leader of that church to talk about the experience that's going on in a language that resonates with that symbolic defensiveness to this fear of death. But it's large and present, particularly around this idea of, again, shared common enemy. So we have to fight the war against cancer or whatever disease process that we have. And I'm not going to give up the fight. I'm not going to, so there's this, again, violent language that we use against these forces that are bringing about death, and trying to help shape some of that language of recognizing that we all got to die as something, right? And so how much agency are you going to have in that process? So,
yeah, it's always been puzzling to me how people who embrace a resurrection theology in their religious tradition feel so strongly that death is the enemy. I can't make that make sense. And so we do consider ourselves to be first and foremost advocates for that person who is dying. So when that pressure is being exerted, we do try to intervene gently, try to bring awareness to that family, bring in the team. We're so fortunate in the way that we're structured that we have our core staff, Dr. Clark, our volunteers, as well as the entire interdisciplinary team through the medical hospice. So the social worker, the chaplain, the nurse, all of those people are very much a part of that care as well. And if we need a family meeting, we have a family meeting. And sometimes it's the family's issues, not the dying person's issues at all. It's simply that family's inability to cope and process, and so they're laying all of that onto this dying person. And I can tell you as a nurse, one of the most frustrating things is when family members refuse comfort medications on behalf of their dying person. And they say, don't give my mother that medicine. The kids are coming after school and I want her to be awake to visit with them. And the mother is lying there saying, please, 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 can I have some morphine? And families try to make those decisions on behalf of that dying person. And if that person still has a voice, we absolutely listen to that person first. And if they don't, and this person starts throwing around, well, I'm the power of attorney. Well, I have decision-making power. I have healthcare proxy. I don't want her to have morphine. She doesn't need it. She always cries like that. Then it becomes really, really difficult and something it takes our whole team to process. And it's traumatizing to the staff, to the volunteers, to the hospice staff. But families can often go to extremes to service these feelings that they have of their own.
Yeah. Which makes you, we'll leave you with the last lesson. And the lesson that I got asked by one of my most poignant patients was, what are you waiting for? Don't wait till death comes knocking at your door to do all this work. Start now. So that was probably the biggest lesson I have ever learned. He looked me straight in the face and said, don't you wait like let me be the example to you. Don't wait. Don't wait to rectify your life. Don't wait to do the things that you say that matter most. Do them now. Yeah.
I think normalizing the conversation is the most important place to start. And you look for those openings wherever you can. So if you're with your family and you're talking about a current event, a tragedy, an accident, something that's happened, and you say, gosh, that must have been so awful for those parents and children. I wonder if they knew what to do. Do you know what I would want you to do? And you start asking those questions and you normalize the conversation that it's okay for us to talk about this. We're a family. It's okay for us to discuss it. Dying or talking about it doesn't make it happen. That you begin to ask the questions that maybe are spurred by something else going on, but at least get started. You have to start somewhere. And I don't think you're going to sit down with your daughter out of the blue if you've never had this conversation and say, I really think we need to reflect on whether or not we're living the fullest life possible and how we can make that happen. So start small and make baby steps and normalize that conversation as much as you can so that it's not so scary, and that there's what we often refer to as a conspiracy of silence, where everyone is protecting each other from a very obvious piece of information, whether that the person in the room is dying and the dying person knows it and the loved ones know it, but they're each hiding from each other because they're protective. And you gotta break that conspiracy and let people know that it's okay. We're not going to cause anything to happen just simply by talking about it.
There was a nice modeling by the grandfather.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
He was very gentle.
Yeah. And
Yes,
he taught that kid a lot.
Is this uncomfortable for you or something like that?
Yeah. So just for those of you in the back, Ron mentioned the modeling that was done by the grandfather and the grandson, right? As a person that's taking care of kids who are dying and taking care of their siblings, it is important to talk to these kids honestly and directly and answer their questions, not with euphemisms, but direct and honest. And the more direct and honest we can be in our day-to-day lives, at work. Can we have a lunch and learn on grief? Right? So you don't have to go straight to death, right? You can kind of ease your way into it, because I can guarantee you there are people suffering in the walls of your work right now in severe loneliness because of grief. Right now the Surgeon General's number one agenda item is loneliness. It costs companies upwards of $154 billion a year in loneliness. And a lot of it is because of grief. And so it's everywhere. Just got to start.
We offer a program called Death Over Dinner, and it's a guided conversation. You put together the guest list up to like 10 people. We'll serve a meal. We'll host you at Clarehouse, and we'll sit around with your people. We will give some homework for everybody to do before the dinner, something to read, something to watch, something to listen to that's kind of on the topic, so that it gets people thinking along those lines, like maybe a section of this video or something like that. And then we just have a meal and we sit around, and we don't necessarily facilitate the conversation with questions or any kind of agenda. We just start asking some questions. So what did you think about the story that you read? Where did you go in your mind when you read that? And I have been a part of some of those meals where families have had the most amazing conversations. I've been a part of that where families have gotten into arguments because they didn't know certain things that had already been put into place, and it came out at this dinner, and somebody got mad because his sibling had decision-making power and he didn't, and it came out, and we were able to talk through that. So we'll help you. We'll even help you have the conversation. So get in touch with Brittany if you want to host a meal like that at our house.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this incredible, wonderful, and learn so much. But one thing I don't fully understand is when you're talking about death being the most creative endeavor of your life. I don't get it. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So it's a rare thing that a human actually gets to create something wholly new to our species. Fire, language, the atomic bomb, the crazy list of things that, particularly in the last century, we got to the moon, right? These crazy new creations that we have the power to do. Most of the time, we're just innovating, taking old stuff and making things new. But in your death, it is the one single opportunity that we are guaranteed to create something wholly new. Oh, yeah. Ron says Holy. Yeah.
Thank you
Well, we just
all.
want to say thank you. This is amazing.
I know we've run over again, and I hope that you take a few minutes to fill out those evaluations because it really helps guide us with our series. We have lots of programming available through our education, so keep checking our website, check your emails, and come back and talk with us again. Thank you.